Ukraine claims to have liberated 6,000 square kilometres of its own territory.
Ukraine!
So what does this tell us about the offensive and the nature of the war up to this point? So far, the Ukrainian offensive has had the effect of making the Russians withdraw from the whole of the Kharkiv Oblast, the whole of the Kharkiv region, and that opens up the area to the south, the Donbass, which is what President Putin said he must take as his minimum requirement in this war. So the Ukrainians are now, certainly in that part of the front, able to dictate terms.
Slava Ukraini! Героям слава!
And they can decide where they want to go next with their offensive. And then down in the southwest, in Kherson, they are actually pushing very hard in order to retake that city. That might be a tougher job, but I suspect that they will take it eventually because they're moving in on it from 3 different sides. Western weapons were key to this offensive, partly because they allowed the Ukrainians to run this battle as if it was a Western army. So it used the long-range weapons, the accurate, precise weapons that the West had given it, in order to target Russian rear areas, the ammunition dumps, the headquarters, the centers of logistics, some of the bridges that would be critical to them. And they pinned Russian forces in place, making it very difficult for them to move around and almost impossible for them to get reinforcements before they began the battle. And then when the battle began, they were able to use not so much Western tanks, but Western protected mobility, all of the various armored vehicles that are necessary to move troops around a battlefield quickly and safely. One of the interesting points about this is that whereas the Russians use lots of vehicles with tracks on, tracked vehicles that are very heavy, the vehicles that the Ukrainians were using tended to be wheeled vehicles. They've got some tracked vehicles and tanks and so on. But a lot of their mobility was based on wheeled vehicles, which are faster and more mobile and more agile. And so they've gone for speed in this offensive, and it seems to have paid off using Western methods, Western training, and quite a lot of Western equipment. This offensive has exposed the fragility, the brittleness of Russia's military machinery, because their troops are not especially well motivated, they don't seem to be very well trained or very well supplied, and the speed at which they have collapsed. They haven't just withdrawn, they have collapsed. The officer seems to, too many officers seem to have run away, and when the officer runs away, the men just disappear. Why should they stay if the officer is not prepared to stay and take risks? And the as it were, years of neglect of Russian forces have become pretty clear. And it isn't just the scratch forces who seem to have disintegrated. The 1st Guards Tank Army seems to have disintegrated. The 1st Guards Tank Army is one of their elite units. It's one of their best units, and yet it seems to have withdrawn in a hurry, leaving most of its tanks behind. If a Guards tank regiment doesn't have its tanks, it doesn't have anything. It's the same seems to have happened to the 4th Guards Tank Regiment. And so this has been a real humiliation, not just for the militias and the Chechens and the Wagner private military companies who are working for the Russians. This has been a humiliation to some of the elite regiments of the Russian army, and they haven't had anything as bad as this on an open battlefield. They haven't lost on an open battlefield like this since December 1942. I don't think it's true to say that the operation in the southwest in Kherson was all a decoy to draw Russian forces away from the Kharkiv region, although it did have that effect. All the evidence is that the Ukrainians fully intend to conduct a 2-pronged offensive, and that is indeed what they're doing. The New York Times has recently reported that this offensive, this 2-pronged offensive, was being war-gamed out by British, American and Ukrainian officers together to make sure that they thought that it was feasible and that they could do it. And the offensive in Kherson is strategically more important than the offensive up in Kharkiv in the northeast, because Kherson is a more important city, and if they get control back of Kherson and that coastline, then they can threaten all of Russian-occupied Crimea, which would be a major strategic advantage to Kiev. Of course, it's one thing to attack an area, an army then has to hold it. But in this case, the Ukrainians are liberating their own territory. They don't have any problems of domestic order when they move on. The villages and towns are delighted to see them and only too happy to get themselves back on their feet after Russian occupation. So the Ukrainians have the benefit of being able to keep on moving forward with just administrators and civilians coming in to try to sort out the mess that whatever was left by the Russians who have retreated. When you're invading a foreign country that doesn't want you there, for every town and village that you take, you've got to leave more troops behind, so your offensive gets thinner and thinner the more territory you conquer. When you're reconquering your own country, you don't have to leave anybody behind. And so the Ukrainians shouldn't have any problem in actually holding on to the territory they have taken, as long as they've got the right equipment and follow-on numbers, just to, as it were, solidify the lines of communication, not the battle lines, but their logistical communication lines. They need to keep those safe, just in case the Russians try a counterattack. When we think about what happens next, on the Ukrainian side, they get to make the next set of decisions. The momentum is with them, they're moving forward, they can decide if they want to end this offensive quite soon, or whether they want to try to go for liberating more territory in the Donbass, or even more territory further south, somewhere south of Zaporizhia, even as far down as Mariupol or Melitopol on the coast. They get to choose. For the Russians, what happens next is that they have to buy time. They're going backwards, there's no natural line that they can stop at, so they need to dig in somewhere and wait for the winter. And then what happens next is that there will almost certainly be a major strategic offensive by the Russians, probably early next year, and that may be another big turning point in the war. One thing we're all certain about is that President Putin will not be giving up. Although he can't do very much about these battlefield losses in the short term, he will try to keep Ukraine under pressure, probably by attacking the civilian population, by attacking the critical national infrastructure, maybe by a series of cyber attacks. He will up the ante for what this whole war is about. And undoubtedly, he will try to do something that takes everybody by surprise. And so he'll respond to this battlefield reversal, not by giving up, but by actually taking the war in a different direction. And both Ukraine and the Western backers of Ukraine will have to be ready for that.